Why don't we go ahead and get started while they sort out the technology? So, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speakers for this week. We just lost Gerardo, but Gerardo's on the screen. So, Gerardo Reyes Chavez is a key leader of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which you will hear me call CIW, mobilizing communities across the world to advocate for the rights of exploited workers. Through CIW's Fair Food Program, he has facilitated unique partnerships among farmers, farm workers, and retail food companies to ensure humane wages and working conditions for the workers on participating farms. He is a farm worker and has worked in the fields since age 11, first as a peasant farmer in Mexico, and then in the fields of Florida, picking oranges, tomatoes, blueberries, and watermelon. He has been a member of CIW since 1999 and has worked with consumer allies to organize national actions and the campaign for fair food. As part of implementing the Fair Food Program, he conducts workers' rights education with thousands of farm workers on participating farms. He has also been featured in numerous publications and documentaries and is a 2018 Aspen Institute Ricardo Salinas Scholar. We also have Greg Asbed, who is a co-founder of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and a principal author of the CIW's Fair Food Program and Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Model, a breakthrough approach to verifiable human rights enforcement recognized by observers from the United Nations to the U.S. Department of Agriculture for its unique effectiveness in combating forced labor, sexual violence, and other human rights violations prevalent in agriculture. He coordinates relations among farm workers, global food retailers such as Walmart, Whole Foods, McDonald's, and agricultural industry leaders in the development, implementation, and expansion of the Fair Foods Program's innovative rights standards. He is a 2017 MacArthur Fellow and received the 2015 President Medal for Extraordinary Efforts in Combating Human Trafficking, the 2014 Clinton Global Citizen Award, and the 2013 Roosevelt Freedom from Want Medal on behalf of the CIW. He also spent 18 seasons harvesting watermelons across the southeastern United States. And last but certainly not least, we have Tripti Poddar, who is a legal consultant with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Tripti's work is informed by years of fieldwork across India and Nepal, partnering with communities that face acute and intersectional marginalization. She has worked extensively with tea plantation workers across different Indian states in developing models of corporate and government accountability to address rights violations by securing better working conditions, amongst others, through tools like legal education, research, advocacy, and strategic litigation. In addition to tea plantation workers, she also has experience of working and writing on a broad spectrum of issues, including housing rights, maternal health, refugee law, citizenship and immigration, labor law, and other constitutional law issues. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Hello. Yes. Thank you all for coming. We know it's there's a lot of other competition out there in the world, especially these days. Like just seeing what's happening out there in the world is enough to distract you. We're just going to run a video real quick. It's a CNN video, about 5 minutes, and it's a really good way of capturing what the Fair Food Program is, its elements, its history, and its impact. And then we'll go deeper into all of that after that. So let's just start with that.
5:30 a.m. in Immokalee, Florida. It's a dark morning under an overcast sky as Alejandrina Carrera begins the 40-minute walk to her sister's house to drop off her 2 small children. It's too early for them to go to school, and they're too young to stay home alone. But Alejandrina has a bus to catch. Every day, hundreds of migrant farm workers, like Alejandrina, come to this parking lot in the center of town, where they board old school buses that take them to the fields. Hey. Alejandrina picks tomatoes on a farm about 30 minutes away. She likes her job now and says she's treated with respect. But it wasn't always that way. Alejandrina came to Immokalee from Mexico more than 20 years ago. She was alone, just 14 years old, small, scared, and extremely vulnerable. She says it didn't take long for someone to take advantage of her. It happened at one of the first farms she worked at. She says her boss promised her a better job in a warehouse. But as soon as she got in his truck, he drove to a remote part of the farm, and she knew she was in trouble.
Y el Señor me dice, si no haces por las buenas.
He told me if we don't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. I was afraid and trembling. He tried to abuse me sexually, but he didn't get to because another worker heard me screaming and came to help me. The next day, the boss fired us both.
Agricultural workers are without a doubt the most vulnerable workers in the United States, and I would say across the world.
John S. Forms is co-owner of Sunripe Certified Brands, where Alejandrina works today.
Let's talk about reality here. This is farming. This is agriculture. Agriculture has, from the very early days of man farming and needing to have work, has been full of opportunities for abuse.
His family-owned farm is one of the largest in the U.S. and was the first to join the Fair Food program, an innovative initiative that has been held up as the most comprehensive social responsibility program in U.S. agriculture. Today, nearly every farm in Florida has signed on. The program combines a set of high standards that includes monitoring the farms and educating the workers.
Buenos días.
Leonel Perez works for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW, a nonprofit organization that developed the Fair Food program. Today, CIW is holding a training session with farm workers, teaching them not only what rights they have, but what to do when those rights are violated. Leonel and the other educators here have first-hand knowledge because they are all former migrant farm workers themselves.
Y lo más importante,
The most important thing for me is to be able to talk to other workers because I have a shared experience. I work in the fields too, and now we can work together to end worker abuse.
The Fair Food program works because it has market consequences. If a farm violates the code of conduct, it is suspended from the program and cannot sell to participating buyers, which includes some of the biggest fast food restaurants and grocery stores. It all makes a big difference for those at the bottom of the supply chain, like Alejandrina.
Voy a trabajar libremente.
You can work freely. You're not going to be harassed. You're not going to be insulted. You're not going to be forced to work. There's more respect now.
These days, Alejandrina wakes up in the morning happy to come to work, proud to talk to her kids about the company she works for. And that, she says, is the biggest change of all. Amaryl Walker, CNN.
Gerardo, you want to take it from there?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting us. As you just watched, the video of Alejandrina tells the before and after the program and what it means, in essence, in the implementation for workers. You heard, in this example about how those situations of sexual harassment and sexual assault were all too common, along with many other abuses. But then you heard about how we, through the campaign for fair food, used the market as a solution, the market that was being used to basically extract profits without necessarily doing something for the conditions that workers face, including conditions of sexual assault, modern day slavery, and many other issues. All of these bring me to talk about what's the focus on this conversation, which is heat. And I want to share with you a little bit about what happened with our crew. We had a harvesting cooperative of watermelons. I went to do that job for 14 seasons. And a little bit over 10 years ago, we were harvesting watermelons in the northern part of Florida near the border with Alabama, when one of my friends, one of my closest friends, someone I consider my brother, started to feel the extreme heat of that day. It was probably about 11:30 a.m. He collapsed. He started to, being irresponsive on moving, except for the occasional spasms. And we immediately tried to protect him from the heat by taking our shirts off and putting some of the cold water on them while we were trying to call the ambulance. I went with him to the hospital. Fortunately, he was okay after that. But for a moment, we thought that my brother was dying right in front of my eyes. And we as a crew were absolutely terrified. We understand what it means to work under temperatures that threaten your life, temperatures that threaten it in the moment, but also long term. And that's why these agreements are so important, because through the 14 agreements that we have with the retail food industry, we have been able to create the protections that are needed, including protections around heat, which I will talk about in a second. One of the things that started with the implementation of the program was that in 2010, we were finally able to sit with several growers to talk about how to implement these protections that the retail food industry signed on to as a condition to do business. This pilot started in 2010, and we formed a working group with the first growers that come on to sign on to the program that will later in 2011 will expand to be implemented in the entire tomato growers exchange, which is the organization that represents 90% of the tomato production of companies based in Florida with production up and down the East Coast. And on those conversations, we were able to first make sure that everything that exists in the law is respected and it's applied instead of ignored like in the past in regards to farm workers. And on top of that, implement laws that were necessary, implement rights that were necessary, like shading the fields that have been there for several years, the fair food bonus that gets paid by the participating buyers, the corporations, the not overfilling of the buckets, which is 10% less weight on the shoulder, and that weight means more buckets for you paid for the first time, so an effective 10% increase. The right to form committees on health and safety, and also during COVID, for example, that collaboration allowed us to respond in real time to the threats, to the threat that COVID represents for our community. So all of these have been life-saving protections that have been included through the implementation in collaboration with this working group. And the heat protocols are so important, and they came out directly of the collaboration with the growers and the conversation around the risk that heat represents for workers. As I was mentioning earlier, many of us have had or have witnessed situations in which life is at risk while we are producing the food. And we hear a lot in the news about workers dying in different parts of the country every year. We heard that 2023 came with the hottest July on record, 174 years. And then the last year, we also heard about record-breaking temperatures in many of the counties here in Florida. So for us, it's extremely important, and that's why this conversation led to the creation of heat protocols to be implemented in the fields of participating farms. So it started a couple of years ago. This is going to be the third season. And what happened with this is that workers are guaranteed through a mandatory break every 2 years, the possibility to have some rest and recover and continue working. This led to the inclusion based on a scientific conversation, which sounds weird when you think about, something scientific being discussed as part of the implementation of the overall code of conduct. That led to the understanding that long term, if you are a farm worker and you are exposed to these really high temperatures, one season after the other, you can develop kidney illnesses. And it's proven, according to studies, that electrolytes help to prevent that. So because we understand that, whether people think that this is a debate or not, the temperature in the thermometer doesn't lie. We feel it on our bodies, and we were able to, through this partnership, create the protections that were necessary. So now electrolytes are included in all participating farms from the month of April, the 15th of April to the 15th of November. And this is just to showcase how when workers organize and when workers are the architects of the solution, in this case, the Fair Food Program, the rights that are included make sense, and the importance of collaboration. Now, this happens within a bigger context, which is what is which is what the Fair Food Program represents as a whole, and these protections, are very important, as well as understanding how this type of power works. So I'm going to pass it on to Greg to hear a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Gerardo. So we'll try to be quick because we know that there's not 3 hours for this presentation today, but and also we love question and answer. So just when we get to that part, please be free to ask any questions you got. But take a second just to look at that and kind of think through those elements, because those elements are the essential elements of the Fair Food Program and the worker-driven social responsibility model for social responsibility, for human rights enforcement that it begat, right? So just take a look at that for a second, and then we'll return to that. So what Gerardo just described is the only program in the world of social responsibility that actually enforces human rights in the supplier's operations, right? And what I'm going to do quickly is just get to the why of that. Why is it the only program that does that? And then the how. And this is the how, right? But the why is really simple, and we'll use an analogy to do that. Does anybody here live in places where development is just kind of racing ahead in their community? Like, we're in Florida, right? I don't know what you know about Florida, but development is crazy in Florida. And, these guys throw up 500, 1,000 homes, just like from one day to the next, and sell them, and then on to the next project. In those cases, what they do is they build things with the cheapest materials possible, with slapdash processes. And then all they want to do is to sell it to the public, right? As quickly as they can, the highest price they can, and move on, and get out, right? That's one way of building a house, right? And that might be the way that sort of the analogy in this case is everything else in the corporate social responsibility field, right? There's another way, which people don't do that much these days, but sometimes they do, is to build your own house for your own family, right? Are you going to use the same cheap materials, cheap drywall, whatever that is used in those developments? No, you're going to use the best materials possible. Are you going to just run through it with nails and methods that are just going to fall apart the minute you actually put your family inside the house? No, it's going to be well constructed and last for as long as it possibly can. You're going to build a house that will protect you and your family from the elements and from it will be the place you will live. So you will build it so that you will enjoy it, and it will hold, and it will stay for a long time. That, in the analogy, is the worker-driven, or the Fair Food Program, or the worker-driven social responsibility program, where workers themselves are the architects of the program. And this is the architecture. This is the what, right? How did they do it? You see worker-to-worker education, which was mentioned in the video. A 24/7 complaint line, which I don't think was mentioned in the video, but is absolutely the beating heart of the program in terms of monitoring and enforcing the rules. rigorous auditing, which doesn't even begin to describe how different it is in terms of auditing compared to the rest of the world of social responsibility. But you did hear about market-based enforcement, right? They said if they don't meet these rules, if they don't comply, there's that little arrow with that X in it, they can't sell to 14 of the biggest buyers in the world, including Walmart, McDonald's, Burger King, all these massive buyers, right? So it begins with worker-to-worker education. Well, and let me start to the middle again. The Fair Food Code of Conduct. That's the code, that's the rules, those are the human rights that the workers who built the program decided they wanted to be the heart of the new agricultural industry they want to build, right? New rules, most of that is actually existing law. Like you can't sexually harass people at work. You can't steal their wages. All those things you can't hold people against their will. Amazingly, can't do that. There's all kinds of rules that are regularly broken in agriculture. But beyond that, workers also added, Gerardo mentioned the overfilling of a bucket. Like that rule, that came straight from worker experiences. And no law books, but it's included in the code because it's an experience that workers wanted to get to stop, right? So those are the rules of the thing. And the fair food agreements are the agreements we have with all the buyers that say that they will suspend purchases if we suspend a grower, right? So worker-to-worker education allows workers to be frontline monitors of their own rights because they learn about the rights they have. And they learn about the rest of the model, so they learn how to exercise those rights if they're violated. That's what feeds the complaint process, the 24/7 complaint process, which compared to the rest of social responsibility is like a high definition video compared to a snapshot in a moment in time, right? Rigorous auditing, which again, doesn't begin to describe the difference between that and the rest of auditing that happens. But for example, in our program, the auditors talk to a minimum of 50% of all workers in a workplace. So if there's 1,000 workers, how many is that? 500. You're in college or university. So that, what we're doing 500, most social responsibility, we're doing 5, 10, 15, right? And the analogy there is like a picture and a camera, right? You have how many pixels matters. If you have 10 pixels, you can get a picture of 10 little pieces of color. If you have 500, you'll get a picture, right? But that's still just a picture in time. It's the complaint mechanism that makes it a constant video feed from the field, all backed by market enforcement, which is what concentrates the minds of employers everywhere to no longer allow these things to happen. Because if forced labor is found on a farm in the Fair Food Program, there's no if, and, or but they are out of the program for a fixed period of time. And if they don't meet a reentry audit, they're out until they do. And that's for 6 months, 9 months, and then finally out. So that's the structure. The reason it looks like that is because the people living in the house want it to stay dry. They want to be safe from the outside. They don't want wolves coming in and blowing down their house. They want a house that is solid and will protect them. And that's what they built, right? So their rights will be respected. And now I'll pass it to Tripti.
Perfect. All right. So what we'll talk about in this section is just how the Fair Food Program can actually be replicated, because the program started in tomato farms of Florida, and then now we have a presence across multiple jurisdictions. So when we're talking about being replicated across different contexts, what we mean essentially is a different geography, thereby a completely different set of regulations and laws, different crops, and very, very different socioeconomic realities. Now, the FFP is being implemented across the United States, of course, but also in Chile, also in South Africa, and also potentially in India, which is what I'm here to really talk about. Now, the Indian sugarcane farms, for example, where India is the second largest producer of sugarcane in the world. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yet workers continue to live in abject poverty and extremely deplorable conditions. The workers always get hired by labor contractors, which essentially means that the sugar farms that they're working on, the sugar mills that use the sugar, that make the sugar from the cane that the workers harvest, and companies like Pepsi and Coke that actually use the sugar in their final products have absolutely no accountability to the conditions that the workers in the farms are working on, right? And because of the lack of accountability, what we see is just a whole different level of human rights violations. So the New York Times recently did multiple pieces on how there was forced unnecessary hysterectomies in sugar farms in India. There's also workers that get tied to debt bondage because workers get paid at the beginning of the season as in advance, and then they work through the seasons to pay up that advance, which of course is never enough. And therefore, it's like a perpetual cycle of debt bondage. The other thing also, which Gerardo alluded to, is heat. Now, India in the summers is, I need to check this. I think it's like 104 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's like 40 degrees Celsius. So you're working at such high temperatures. There's no water. There is no shade. Is there a law that can protect you? No. But what the FFP does is actually bring in enforceable standards on how to deal with it. So, that there's all around very, very terrible working conditions for workers, and they merge into a system of generational abuse. And while corporations that continue to make billions of dollars, workers continue to live in abject poverty. And this is really where the Fair Food Program comes in. Using the model that Greg talked about, we're addressing a lot of these very basic issues that workers face that the law should deal with, mentions, but there is no way to enforce it and to hold people accountable. So the New York Times article that I mentioned earlier, as a result of that article, which also mentions a lot of US-based corporations like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, investors got together. The New York City Comptroller's Office brought together investors in these big brands, brought together worker representatives from India, and also invited organizations like the CIW, and especially the CIW that does have a proven track record to address the issues that the article highlighted. Now, at this meeting, the representatives from India met with CIW, met with Craig, and just talking through how an FFP could actually, or a model inspired by the FFP could actually be implemented in the context of India, right? Because the idea was to seek accountability and enforce rights that are already there. Now, the FFP model is very well known across grassroots labor movements across the world, including in India. And so obviously, CIW was sort of the next, was an obvious inspiration to look up to. And so what the FFP has done successfully, which partners in India are looking at implementing, is to leverage market dynamics, which Greg talked about, which Gerardo alluded to, and in using the purchasing power of consumer brands like Walmart, like Whole Foods, sorry. Yes. So using the market power of consumer brands, and for them to leverage the power that they have to require the companies that provide them with farm goods to adhere to certain standards to adhere to certain human rights standards and the accountability mechanisms that the Fair Food Program enforces. Now, the meeting in New York, which was in September 2025, 5 months later, in February, we've sort of forced like a transatlantic partnership where a delegation from India visited Immokalee in December, saw firsthand the power of the transformative change that the FFP can make. They saw how the FFP is a model where workers are able to demand legal enforcement and dignity. And they are now developing an FFP-inspired worker-driven social responsibility model of their own for the sugar farms in India. The starting point for this pilot, of course, for a context that's very different from the context in which the FFP was developed, right? In India, the workforce is massive. It is extremely heterogeneous. There is also many layers of identity that play into the way workers are treated. For example, there's caste, there's a tribal identity, right? So it's important in that context to start small, to start with a pilot program, to really go into the deep ends and think of well-measured steps. Now, the process of a pilot is also complex because it involves forging partnerships. Also, as an organization that developed a program in the US, to find labor organizations in India that are already working with labor rights organizations and forging meaningful partnerships in that sense. And also having conversations with buyers, which, like we've said, hold the ultimate market power, right? And therefore, it's important for this system to be comprehensive and well thought out. Now, what is very special about the worker-driven social responsibility model of the Fair Food Program is that it acknowledges that every context requires its own version of worker-driven social responsibility. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. And what the India example really offers is sort of the potential of the FFP to scale, to replicate across contexts that are very, very different from the context that the FFP was developed in. And this map sort of gives you a figure of that. Thank you.
So, questions and answers? Yes. So Zoom can Gerardo, listen up.
Hello.
Uh,
Thank you for this amazing presentation. It was great to hear from everybody here. Something I'm interested about is that definitely at the core and the center of what makes this program work is that solidarity. It sounds like is that solidarity that you have from the workers to be able to push up or to push out against kind of like the collapse that markets bring into rights and wages. So out of curiosity, what would you name as like the major challenges that threaten that solidarity? And how do you address that?
Gerardo, you want to take a crack at that, or either of us?
Yeah, I can start. But yeah, you are totally right. Since the beginning of us as a community pursuing change, pursuing a place on the table to have dialogue with the growers, solidarity has been key. Especially when we started to focus on the brands that were buying the tomatoes that we produce and now many other fruits and vegetables. It was basically the power that I referred to sometimes as the power of consciousness that we had to build before we get to sit at the table with Taco Bell and its parent company, John Brands, with McDonald's, Burger King. It was the creating common cause with consumers in universities across the country that brought over 300 universities to stand in solidarity with us during the Taco Bell boycott. It was also the endorsement of the National Council of Churches that brought 32 different denominations, religious denominations in the US, to stand with us, to open the doors, to bring volunteers to prepare meals for us as we were on the road from Florida to California, where the Taco Bell headquarters is. And it is that same power that has helped us to get to where we are in regards to all the agreements. Not all brands needed a campaign. There's some exceptions there, and it's also important to notice that. But in general, power consists nothing without a demand. And the voices of consumers everywhere that have stand with us have helped us to get to this point. Now, moving forward, I would add, the limitation in regards to what comes next has a lot to do with resources in the ongoing expansion that we were talking about. There's other iterations of the model being pursued in different places, like the salmon production in Chile. In the map, you see the United Kingdom in the fishing industry. And there's other workers in Central America, also in Spain, for example, in agriculture, that are looking at this model as the potential solution for the problems workers face there. And it's all designed in a form in which workers are the architects of their own solutions. The rights that will be included will be what makes sense for them on the ground. So I would say that. I don't know if you want to add something, Greg.
No, I think that's it. The essential element, the starting element for any WSR program is a worker organization. right? So the CIW was a worker organization from the very beginning, from the early 1990s. And, for the first decade of its existence, it was doing what workers have done forever, which is trying to bring employers to the table through withholding labor, right? And so there was a series of massive community-wide strikes, and then there was a march all the way across Florida for 2 weeks, and there was a month-long hunger strike. All of those things to try to get growers to sit down and simply enter into a dialogue. And it was the inability of the lack of power necessary to actually make the change, the sustainable change that is represented in this program, right? That those actions didn't achieve, that led the organization to continue analyzing more broadly the agricultural industry within the context of the food industry as a whole. And it's when you're working in the fields, like you saw the picture in the melons, right? You're not thinking about where the melons are going to go from the farm. All you're thinking about is if the crew leader is going to pay you, and if the farmer is going to treat you right. That's all you see, right? But once we started to actually, as an organization, see that agriculture is just this tiny subset of the food industry, right? It seems bigger than it is, but it's not. Once we saw that, we realized there was an entire ecosystem of power that went well beyond the fields, and we had to find a way to tap in. And it was what Gerardo mentioned was the solidarity that was necessary. It was already there in the worker community, right? Had been fighting for years. It was the solidarity with consumers that allowed the pressure on the brands to come and sign those agreements with us to then change conditions on the ground.
Sorry, just to add to that, which is sort of the other side of the question that you asked, which is worker-to-worker solidarity within the fields. But also one thing that the program is doing beautifully is creating a network of international worker solidarity, where, like we have workers from India come and see how the program works in Florida. We had workers from Ecuador comes. So I think in this world that is hyper-connected, I think that is one sort of missing connection, and the program really beautifully uses that space to provide solidarity across geographies to workers.
Yeah, I agree. This is a great presentation, and thank you for being here. The power balance, or the creation of power balance between farm workers and growers is super clear to me, but I think that it still seems like the industry has quite a lot of power in this situation. Can you explain how you manage that and how you select who you're going to work with?
Binding legal agreements. It's a 3-word answer to your question. If they were voluntary, the industry would have a ton of power. And that's exactly what CSR is, corporate social responsibility. It's a voluntary arrangement where corporations say something happens, in Bangladesh, the Rana Plaza. I don't know if people have heard about that, but it collapsed and 1,200 people were killed in an instant, right? In a sweatshop, textile sweatshop. The normal answer to that was, we have a code of conduct. So you find, first you go into the rubble, you find the tag, and it's Walmart, right? Or whatever it is. And then the media asks the company, the brand, why is this happening in your thing? And they, well, we have a code of conduct, and we have auditors that go and audit those places of work. And so we're doing everything we can, right? They're not doing everything they can. They don't make the standards in the code mandatory in the sense that they will actually stop purchasing if they're not complied with. And they're also not engaging stakeholders, as they're called, what we call workers, which is stakeholders, in the process. Right? Workers are absent in the process. You have an auditor that shows up for a day or two, once every year, a couple of years, and gets absolutely no information, but turns around and writes a report saying that things are fine. Rana Plaza had been just recently approved as in for structural integrity before it killed all those people, right? So that's traditional CSR, where they have a code that's a voluntary code. They voluntarily hire, which is a conflict of interest if you just stop and think for a second, these auditing firms, and then they voluntarily decide whether to continue purchasing or not. In our case, it's a binding legal agreement between the worker organization at the bottom and the brand at the top. And they have to do 2 essential things. There's more to it, right? But one is to pay a premium so they can help alleviate the generational poverty that has afflicted people at the bottom of supply chains forever. And the other is that they will have to stop buying from suppliers if the workers, through an independent but still worker-connected auditing organization, finds that the supplier is out of compliance. It takes all voluntary, all will, all control out of the picture. And then you can take those, I mean, this is your work, right? But you can take those agreements, if they're violated, to court.
I think, Greg, it would be helpful if you talk about like how many buyers have actually been suspended since the program started, right? Suppliers, sorry. Yeah, because
yeah, it's interesting. You can actually, if you're interested, you can see online, we have all our reports, our annual reports. And you can see there's at one point, about 12 years into the process, we did a trend analysis. And you can see that all the suspensions, there have been about 7 or 8 or 9, I forget exactly, but suppliers have been suspended, but it was all right in that first sort of third of the history, right? It was when all the players were realizing that this is not the same as, business as usual. It was a very different model. And they continued, to some degree, to continue to act as they did before until they realized that there are consequences. And the consequences were real, and they would lose business. And so suddenly, we went from an intense period of remedy, where people's rights were being violated and people were getting their rights vindicated through this program, right? Which is also rare as can be in the world of social responsibility. But we actually went beyond remedy once the message was heard, to prevention. And when you think about things like sexual assault at work, which is common in the food industry, in the agricultural industry, outside the Fair Food Program, I want you to understand how common that is. The CNN video, 14-year-old Alejandrina, she arrived in the United States, and the first thing that happened was just that, right? It doesn't happen in the Fair Food Program. Literally does not happen in the Fair Food Program. And so what you've gone from, even when you have this power of remedy, which is wonderful and rare, you've gone from trying to help people who've already been hurt, right? To actually keeping people whole entirely and not having to carry that scar around forever. So that's the place you want to get in social responsibility, is prevention. And no one else is even close to prevention. Right? Remedy is still a distant goal for most auditors, companies, corporations, suppliers in social responsibility.
Thank you so much for being here. And I read that New York Times article last year when it came out, and it is horrific. I'm curious if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the auditing and reporting process. I know you said that it's like at least 50% are interviewed of the farm workers, but like, what does that look like, and how often is that occurring? And yeah, just more on that.
Yeah, so auditing in and of itself, if all we did was audit, it wouldn't be nearly the program that it is. You know how like you have a couple children, like, which child do you like the most? We actually affirmatively like the child that's called the complaint mechanism more than we do the auditing, right? But we still love our auditing child, because the auditing is infinitely better than what's out there. Right? So the 50% is probably the most easily understood, quantifiable difference between the traditional approach and what we do, right? It's massive. Like, you can't underestimate how important that is, because that helps you not just identify everything that's out there, but also get a measure of it, right? Really get a sense of how important these different things are that could be happening. But our auditors are dedicated auditors only to the Fair Food Program. Most of the social auditing things that exist in the entities that exist in the $80 billion social auditing industry out there today are for profit. We're not, of course. The Fair Food Standards Council is the dedicated, the standalone auditing organization for the Fair Food Program. Only audits to the Fair Food Program's code, right? So every auditor is a complete expert in the field of Fair Food Program code and its enforcement. The numbers are the numbers that we discussed. The approach that they take is again infinitely more profound, deeper than what's done in the auditing industry. And the auditors are the people who take the complaints. They also answer the complaint line. So the complaint line is not some separate line, right? It's the auditors themselves. So the auditors, when they pick up the complaint line and someone says, I'm at a farm, I don't know what his name is, but it's on 27, and the guy who's working here is called Bigfoot Joe, right? That's the crew leader's name, a real name. And the auditors have a database that is massive. Everything that's ever been put together through all the auditing and complaint, right? They can pull up exactly what farm they're at because of that. And then they are automatically starting the complaint investigation the second they get that call, right? It's that weaving in of things. The reason we have the worker education, so the workers can actually collaborate really deeply with both of those processes, the complaint and the audit process. The way we organize that is to have the worker education happen before the audits go in. So the worker education team comes back with a report saying, here's what people talked about. Here are the issues that are at the top of people's minds, right? So keep that in mind as you go out and do the audit, right? And then, workers understand that when the auditors come, who they are. They're not just coming out of the blue. They know that they're part of that team that just came here the other day. And so they understand what their role is as workers is to help the auditors really understand what's happening. So all of that works together, if that gives you an idea. I mean, it's in so many ways, in so many layers, in so many really quantifiable ways. It's so different.
And just to add to that, I think, why this model is called a worker-driven social responsibility model is because through education trainings that workers receive, they are constantly monitoring and auditing, monitoring conditions on the farm, right? So in addition to the formal audit procedures that, ideally happens a couple of times a year on every farm, there's also the constant monitoring that workers do. And so, there's a very comprehensive complaint reporting and tracking mechanism. And I think the latest figures that we have is most complaints get solved within like 2 weeks of being raised, right? So we have a very comprehensive tracking process. And the third thing also is, like Greg said, the education. So even during education, there are sometimes complaints that are received by the educators that then go into the complaints process and then is treated as a complaint. So apart from just the auditing, there are also these other parallel mechanisms that are actually constantly monitoring violations on fields. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and just one more thing on that issue. I mean, let's just stop and think about the existing auditing, the existing social responsibility model, right? The dominant paradigm for the past 30 years in social responsibility. It's the social audit model, right? What is it based on? Like, what? Just literally stop and think for a second. It's based on a visit. Short visit, 1 or 2 days every year or every 2 years to a workplace. And it's there to monitor and in theory enforce rights that are essentially crimes against people: wage theft, sexual assault, forced labor, verbal abuse, all these things that happen every single day. Okay? They don't happen on a schedule. They don't happen on the audit schedule, and they don't happen in bunches. They happen every single day. So how in the world, where did this fiction come from, and why do people believe it? That a visit of 1 or 2 days every couple of years could actually result in, and here's the truly most absurd part of it, a certificate that says this workplace shall be free of the many crimes that occur to workers for the next 2 years henceforth. Think about that. Like, if you lived in a community where the mayor, where there's a massive crime spree, and the mayor said, "Don't worry about it, we got this. We're bringing in a crack team. They're going to be here tomorrow. They'll certify us crime-free for the next couple of years." Would you even begin to accept that idea? No, right? But we all accept it when we think fair trade is cool, because fair trade works on that exact basis. We all accept it when we think Rainforest Alliance is cool, because that's how they work too. So we just kind of look for a label, right? When we're consumers, if we see the label that we like, we feel okay about it. But think about the idea behind the label and how it works. And then think about this and realize the immense gulf of Mexico between us and them. All right.
You thought about that name, didn't you?
Yeah, that wasn't me. I don't even, it's like an echo. That wasn't anybody here.
It was Gulf of Mexico, Greg. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe we can do that.
Thank you so much. In this particular model, are there also developing or existing examples of worker-driven social responsibility outside of the food industry, such as the garment industry or so? And if so, what kind of challenges and opportunities are there for this model?
Gerardo, you got that one?
Um, it was not very clear over here. Sorry.
Are there examples of WSR outside of agriculture?
Oh yeah, yeah. I can start if you want to add some points. It in fact started earlier on the implementation of the Fair Food Program because it started in Florida, 2011, in most farms, most companies. Then it started to expand 3 seasons after that, and around that time, a little bit before, we started to expand to Georgia, the Carolinas, all the way up to New Jersey. A group of workers from the dairy industry in Vermont, represented by Migrant Justice, came to see us. They wanted to see how we were able to establish these agreements. They wanted to learn how they work. So they shadow the process of education. They also shadow the auditing team from the Fair Food Standards Council, and also the campaigning, because we were, and we continue to do that. Now we have a boycott of Wendy's. We have a campaign focusing on Kroger, trying to bring them to the program. So they were doing all of that with the purpose of replicating it and adapting it to the dairy industry, which has very specific issues. It's different in regards to the size of the farms. They tend to be smaller, and they have very particular needs as workers in terms of their rights. So they crafted it after the program. We help them replicate it, and now they are working with Ben & Jerry's implementing it. The name of it is Milk with Dignity. Similar to that, another iteration of the model here in the US comes from CETUR, Centro de Trabajadores Unidos en la Lucha, and they have been working to craft a code of conduct called Building with Dignity and Respect. And this last year, actually, they were announcing the first agreements of its kind with some nonprofit, not construction companies, developers that are doing their job as nonprofits, from what I understand. And they are implementing something similar, but for construction outside the US. Greg was mentioning earlier the example of the Rana Plaza collapsed in Bangladesh. Some of the things that are part of the health and safety, for example, for us as workers, are also being implemented over there and in other places across the globe. So, at the end, what is important to remember is that this is all about making it worker-driven, about workers having not just the driving seat, but having the keys of the vehicle that they are driving in different places, different industries.
Yes.
Thanks. Thank you very much. This is inspirational. I'm a little curious. You talked about, enforcing the agreements from the producer up. I'd love to hear you talk about the top end. Like, does Walmart or Whole Foods or Taco Bell have to make some agreement? We won't buy from anyone who doesn't.
Yeah.
And you said that was driven by consumer demand. So was that? I'm just curious about how that played out.
Those are actually the binding agreements behind the program, right? The binding agreements are between the worker organization, in this case, the CIW, and the brands. So we have 14 agreements with companies like Walmart, McDonald's, not like them. We have Walmart, McDonald's. We have all those companies have signed binding legal agreements with us to suspend purchases from growers who we suspend from the program, among other things. There's other things in those agreements as well. Whatever the crop is that they've agreed on, right? We do not cover all of their crops, unfortunately. I mean, and that's something that interested, curious consumers could always call the company and say, why don't they cover more of their crops? We had to fight to get tomatoes. We had to campaign and do massive protests, countrywide tours, all this stuff to get the agreements on tomatoes to reform the tomato industry, which was the first target that we had, right, in Florida, because it's where Immokalee is located. And so everybody in Immokalee works somehow in or around the tomato industry. But it is expanding, as you can see, to other crops, but it's slower than, when we launched in 2010, we launched with over 90% of the Florida tomato industry at once, 30,000 workers from 0 to 60 like that. So those agreements are in fact the agreements. With the growers, we don't have agreements, we simply have the code of conduct. They sign that they will abide by the code of conduct, right? And so they actually could step out of the program if they wanted to, if they didn't have a financial interest. But the way the market works is a powerful thing, And so the market keeps them in the program because they want to be able to sell to all these major buyers. So that's why we went to get those agreements at the top. And the way to get those, because this is important too, is that when we think about the food industry, we think the Walmarts and McDonald's of the world are the top, right? But the highest mountain is us, right? Consumers. We are above them. Normally we act and consume in an atomized way. We do it ourselves, right? But if we act concertedly, and this is not just theory or something that would be nice to have happen, that's how we got these agreements. If we act concertedly and pressure those companies to act differently, eventually they will. And again, to me, it's a shock that it did, but it worked, and it didn't just work one time. It worked. We have 14 agreements and we're going to get more and more. So it's really a fact that if we act together, we can get the major corporations to act differently themselves.
Unfortunately, I think we are running out of time, but also wanted to, before we thank Greg and Tripti and Gerardo, for students, CIW will be sticking around. So if you want to continue a conversation, have more questions, 3:30 in room 105, we'll have a student session. Otherwise, if someone has a very quick, 20-second question, and Greg can keep his comments to 40 seconds, we could try for one more question. Yeah. Okay. We have a faculty who can't come to the student event.
Super quick. I'm actually from South Florida. I grew up 2 hours away. So super quick. I'll keep it quick. I have 15 seconds left. Damn, I wasted 5. Wages. How do you situate compensation or wages in the code of conduct conversations? I imagine you have to.
Not a short question.
Yeah. Well, you go 35 now.
There's a bunch of wages since the program have almost doubled. So that's a quick answer, right? How that happened has a multiple, is a multiple answer. One, for example, again, Gerardo mentioned the overfilling of buckets. That was a standard across the industry, where you get paid by bucket, right? You get 40 cents, for example, in the past, per bucket, but they force you to put in 3 or 4 extra pounds in each one above, like a ice cream cone, right? And that would lead to fights and violence and all this stuff in the past about whether it was full enough or not. Now the rule that we created was no single tomato can be fully above the rim. Simple rule, visual standard, right, for enforcing it. And that created a 10% across the board wage increase because people actually got paid for all those pounds they weren't picking before. So there's that. There's the premium. We have more than $55 million of premium, that penny per pound that you heard about, that the buyers pay. It goes to the workers and as a line item in their budget, says Fair Food Program bonus on their paychecks, 55 million and more counting every year. That has been transferred from the top directly to the bottom. That's increased wages, right? We have the fact that people now control, there were never any time clocks in the fields, all right? Never. Your time was kept by a crew leader who wrote the time down whenever he or she decided they wanted to say that you started work and when you stopped work, right? But it was a way of actually cheating you out of minimum wage every day because they would always put fewer hours. So if what you made didn't come up to minimum wage for the actual hours you worked, magically you worked fewer hours and all of a sudden what you earned covered minimum wage when you are paid by the piece. Long story. Anyway, that's the way. When you work at that level, that's how pay happens. And we now have time clocks and workers have to control the punching in and punching out. And so companies started to actually stop bringing workers to the fields, for example, 3 hours before work started. so that they would just be there the second the work magically needed to start, but they didn't get paid for those 3 hours of waiting time. Now, if they have to wait, they get paid, and they get paid for everything. So wages have gone, and the bucket rate, which for 30 years before we actually launched this program was absolutely stagnant by Department of Labor statistics. Stagnant, the piece rate for buckets. In the 15 years since this program has been happening, has almost doubled. And so you have the reason that's happened in part is because companies now realize that being an employer of choice comes with value, right? Because they never competed for workers before. But now with this program, they realize workers stay and you keep the best workers because you get treated more humanely than you do in other parts of agriculture. So along with that, raising the piece rate has gone up as well.
Not a short answer.
I told you, I said beforehand, I said it was not a short answer.
I get the privilege of working with Greg and can attest that he might write the longest emails of anybody I've ever met in my life.
But they're fun.
Still lots of questions. Students, if you can, please do join us at 3:30 in room 105. Otherwise, if we can have a big thank you to Greg, Gerardo, and Tripti.
Thank you.
Next week? Do we have speaker series next week? I think we're back in 2 weeks. I think we're back in. Yes, so they work restoring indigenous and African American seeds and crops in the US. So